I'd like to talk a bit about the change in G6 chairmanship this year. So while in the past you've enjoyed the media personalities of John Humphreys and Fiona Bruce, what you told us is that you very much did like the hard interview style, but how about coupling that with somebody that knows the shared services and sourcing space like the back of their hand? So I'm very pleased to introduce the woman with over 30 years experience who needs little introduction, Deborah Kops, Managing Director, Sourcing Change. Welcome.
Naomi said, this is a very different panel. You selected these gentlemen, and they are gentlemen, or so I've been told. And what hopefully you'll hear today is folks who have the ability to express themselves without reservation. But to start this off very lightly after a long lunch, what I'd like to do is ask the G6 to make their way down the side of the room. G6. Come on. I have to tell you, I dared them to do a conga line. These guys just don't have what it takes. But by the end of this session, we'll see what comes out of them. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. Tom Bagman, also known as Buzz Lightyear. He is a leader in the toy box that we call finance and accounting transformation. He's responsible for business development and global deals in Europe as Hackett's Group Vice President of Business Transformation. As a recognized thought leader, he takes his clients to infinity and beyond, always moving the benchmark to the next level. Welcome, Tom. The Flash, Nick Jarman. Now you see him, now you don't. He possesses superhuman reflexes, moving his shared services clients to new financial heights at super speed as a partner in PricewaterhouseCoopers. Working around the globe, he always violates certain laws of physics, but he never gets in the way of regulatory requirements. Nick Jarman. Are you scared yet? Rakesh Sagnani. For those of you who grew up on Batman and Robin like I did, I actually saw the first version. You know that Batman is not a superpower, but a man who makes superior use of intellect, detective skills, science, and technology in an indomitable will. Rakesh brings these very same skills to the shared services and BPO industry as a partner and ProServe, a leader in the fight for better business process. Rakesh.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. All right, Peter Muller. How do you like that one? He's a man of super agility. I didn't bring the girl this time, or he didn't rather. Super agility, reacting to changes in the market with his spider sense. A highly esteemed advisor, he battles the foes of high cost and low efficiency across Europe to help his clients sustain competitive advantage. A shared services consulting veteran of super strength. Few of you have had the pleasure of seeing the softer side of Peter, his alter ego, Peter Parker. Remember, as Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. I welcome Peter Muller. What a surprise. They're still my friends. Okay, next. This one looks really good, don't you think? Ritesh Idnani, quiet and always composed. You think he was merely a more handsome version of Clark Kent. But this gentleman has demonstrated a superhuman ability to drive the BPO operations of Infosys. His ability to fly, and he does quite a bit, is a great assist in managing global operations, sales, and client relationships for Infosys. Soaring through Infosys's ranks, welcome Ritesh Idnani. And last but not least, see what I do to you, Mark. Do you know who that is, Mark? It's the Incredible Hulk.
Oh, thanks. Let's see how this is going to go on now.
Okay, he possesses potential for limitless physical strength with aliases such as David Banner and Mark Breton. His durability and endurance are two of his key attributes as head of BPO UK and Europe for TCS. A veteran of the sourcing industry, his career has been resistant to most forms of injury and damage, and he has regenerative and healing abilities. Mark Breton.
You have to get a kiss for the Hulk thing.
Yeah, I had to make up to him. Okay, so much for the fun and games. Now we'll go to the second round. Format today, we're going to have a number of questions posed to these esteemed panelists, and towards the end of the discussion, we'll invite you to throw whatever low balls or high balls you care to send us. Let's start out, since so many of you are part of, are pursuing shared services. I'm going to ask a question, and this will be, hopefully we'll get some interesting responses because we've got two BPO providers whose stock and trade is convincing all of you to go the BPO route. And then there are 4 advisors here who really don't care, right? As long as the money comes in the pocket. So question number 1, gentlemen. What factors should drive customers to set up shared services as opposed to outsource? Who'd like to take this first?
I'd be happy to take that one, Deborah. I guess to start, I would probably say that's the wrong question.
Cheeky.
Because I think we're in an age where we've evolved from that discussion around shared services versus outsourcing. I think the discussion is now shared services versus outsourcing versus both shared services or outsourcing, and outsourcing, versus neither shared services and outsourcing. You know, we've recently advised a client not to do shared services or outsourcing and actually automate some of their IT, because what they were looking for was a quick payback. What they were looking for was not a humongous amount of change in their organization, and it was the right decision for them. So really the question is, what are the outcomes that you're looking for as an organization? And then what vehicle? Is it shared services? Is it outsourcing? Is it hybrid shared services and outsourcing? Or is it neither and just enabling your technology to work better?
Peter.
Yeah, I think the balance has changed considerably in the last 5 or 6 years. So whilst outsourcing in say, the finance arena has been going on for 20 years, probably 60, 70% of the deals have been in the last 5 years. And when I helped organizations 5 or 6 years ago, the assumption was shared services unless there's a compelling reason why outsourcing makes sense. I would say that the balance has shifted, and you should now think it's probably outsourcing unless shared services make sense, or, as Rakesh says, it's outsourcing and a captive center of excellence for higher value activities and so forth, hub and spoke. So I think and the reason it's changed over the last 5 or 6 years is because the capability of the BPO providers is just so much greater than it was then. I mean, they really are now experienced. You know, look at F&A, they've probably got 20, 30, 40 good references in various sectors. They've got their delivery networks globally. They've got their Six Sigma lean continuous improvement capabilities, and it's a different story to how it was 6 years. It's not right for everyone. If you don't have the scale, if you don't have stable processes, if they're not in control, if your ERP makeup is just too messed up, it might not be the right time. But outsourcing is definitely becoming something to look at.
So you've been drinking new Kool-Aid since that we were up on the stage 2 years ago, huh?
Not just Kool-Aid.
Not just Kool-Aid. Ritesh.
You know, I'll firstly thank Peter because he's just done the sell job for us. You know, if I were to elevate the problem statement, I think I agree with what Rakesh said in some sense. The question needs to be framed rather differently. What's the business problem that you're looking to really solve within the organization is really the moot point. Is it an efficiency play? Is it an effectiveness problem? Is it a cash flow issue? And I think a lot of these drivers, in some sense, determine the choice of operating model more than anything else. The fact that you end up going down the path of shared services or outsourcing or a hybrid is incidental from an execution standpoint. But I think you've got to elevate the problem statement one level higher to the strategic drivers behind doing anything at all or doing nothing at all. And I think that's the question that at least a lot of us are asking or working with clients and prospects to see where are they in that life cycle before even getting down to the implementation side of the house.
You know, that's an interesting point. This is the first time I've ever been on a panel where consultants and providers have said, maybe you should do nothing at all. Tell me specifically, Nick, when should a client do nothing at all?
Well, I mean, I don't know the example that was used here. But I think it's very easy to characterize this debate at quite a high level without understanding actually what we're trying to solve. So we talk about the business issue we're trying to solve. So I think the debate comes down to the use of technology, the sourcing strategy, but a lot of what your organization is trying to achieve around process and technology. So if I look at a lot of the debates that we get into now about whether to go outsourcing or captive, the bit that I'm not clear about, and I'm not clear from the BPO provider's perspective, is how you work effectively across two groups within the client organization, so in terms of the business and the IT support, given the fact that finance and IT within many organizations don't work well together. So how you make that work with an additional party, and then what you're trying to achieve in terms of 3 to 5 years' time. So if I look at that, I'd say an outcome would be, and when we look at technology and what we said 10, 15 years ago about lights out accounting, why has lights out accounting disappeared from the conversation? We talked about innovation. So if we're going to talk about really making finance as a function really hum, then it's not about BPO shared services. It's about actually getting in underneath and understanding the business process. So I'm interested to, kind of the dynamics that play out both in the BPO and the captive side and people's view on that.
Tom, you always have a view,
I always
besides a great haircut.
I think the question's still relevant. I think, though, that we should not discuss BPO versus captive sort of in a religious black and white mode, what it used to be. But obviously, you still need to decide what you're going to do. I think it comes down from more the strategic level in terms of what kind of service delivery model I'm setting up and whether these are activities that in the long run I want to keep within the organization. And that gives you a certain guidance in terms of direction. When you look at the performance of the two groups, they're pretty close nowadays. They could change in the future, but today they're pretty close.
I disagree. I think that's still just a strategic view. I think the value of this debate is at the detailed level. So what I found interesting is that big global corporates who say things like, we don't understand our SAP system, but they're trying to decide between outsourcing and captive. Now, if you don't understand your underlying ERP and what you're running your transactions on, why are you trying to decide who executes those transactions? So there's a fundamental mismatch between what people are kind of debating and actually what provides value and efficiency within the organization.
The reality is that there are, I call them the 8 levers of back office transformation. It applies to finance, it applies to other functions. And so any organization looking at transforming its back office, it's got to think about elimination, simplification, automation, standardization.
Do you have any more uns?
You said
eliminate,
so
simplify, automate, standardize, consolidate, outsource, offshore, continuously improve. And the smarter amongst you will realize that's a nice little acronym, SSCOOC.
SS Kook.
SS Kook. No.
Do you have regulatory permission to say SS Kook?
Absolutely, yeah.
we're gonna have an SS Kook too,
so
are we, as
the
well?
point is that shared services is about consolidation, and then you've got outsourcing, you've got offshoring, but you also need to think about standardization, about automation, about elimination, about simplification. And it's not necessarily in any one order. You've got to look at the whole order. The difficult thing isn't probably in defining what the end state needs to look at. It's how the hell you get there from the mess you're in now, particularly with ERP systems, business units, decentralized fragmentation.
That's why when you look at the two groups who outsource mostly, when we compare to their performance, you'll find out it's mostly either the ones who are really good or the ones who are really bad. Because the ones really good are sort of at the end of this cycle. There's nothing else they could do captive or internally. But there might be somebody who has access to tools to provide those things that you elaborate on. And then the other ones are the ones who are typically really bad, because they don't find a way to overcome all these problems internally. So it's more an implementation-based logic to actually then outsource.
But for me, I think it's a journey. I guess going back to Nick's point, why are companies so still hung up on IT? Why have we started to see board-level guys who are now CIOs, not IT directors? It's about information. Why are we seeing companies picking up who are pure-play BPOs before, investing in technology capability? Because they want to join it up and take it away. And I think that's where the opportunity lies. I'm sure we're going to talk about platforms later on, but this is
I'll
the
think
journey
about it.
towards that.
I ask the two of you, since the two of you represent the provider community up here, and then I'd like the consulting panel to chip in. What capabilities do BPO providers have to transform business processes that organizations, quite frankly, who are going down the shared services route don't have? And I'm not talking about expensive consultants, but what's your secret sauce that the ladies and gentlemen in the room who are going down a shared services route
Lots
don't
of
have?
experience of doing it for lots of different companies. If you're a single organization, you're going to do it with the knowledge that you have of your own business. What we will both bring, and companies like us will bring, is lots of different experience from different markets, different industries, lots of transitions that have been through, and we will hear, the journey that you go through from the beginning of an outsource all the way through to making it go live. It's a short, quick route to get there, and why not capitalize on the learning?
Do you believe that, Peter?
Yes, I think the two biggest things they have, one is the investment capital. You're amortizing this across 30, 40 clients for, let's say, a BPO platform. Secondly, the hunger. If you don't do it, you're not going to get selected. It's survival of the fittest. I mean, I have people who go out every month looking at BPO providers. If they don't tick every single box, and there's a box that says innovation, technology, platforms, if they don't tick the box, you don't get down selected. A captive, it's set up. The risk is, after 3 or 4 years, it's out of date. It hasn't kept up pace. With you guys, if you don't keep up to date with what the other guys are doing, you just won't win business.
And I think it's fair to say that the BPOs today are very mature. The first big F&A BPO contract, I think, was in 1991, Accenture and BP.
No, actually 1996, but we won't quibble.
Well, I think it was 91, but we won't quibble. 20 years later, here we sit with all of the providers having significant capability, having invested in the right tools and methodologies, having focused on processes and having the right level of process knowledge. But that doesn't mean it's the right decision for every organization, because actually, even though the BPO providers are mature, an organizational culture, an organizational change readiness is much more important than how good the BPO provider is, because the BPO provider can be great. If the organization's not ready for outsourcing, then it's not the right decision for that particular organization.
But isn't there a natural tension between the objectives? So on the one hand, you say, and I remember 20 years ago, paper saying finance of the future, lights out accounting. So on the one hand, you say a world-class finance function is going to run the transactions in a more automated manner. So you take the procure to pay, which has been the one that's sort of led the way around lights out accounting, and the intelligent scanning technology that allows you to do that. So on the one hand, you're driving out the activity and automate it. On the other hand, you're saying we'll offshore people for an arbitrage, which reduces the revenue for the providers. So there's no judgment in this. I'm just saying there's a natural tension between driving the process and technology to reduce the activity to outsourcing and maintaining a cost base that drives revenue.
Yeah, I agree.
Which
It's
is-
not the capabilities, it's the incentives to do it. I mean, why would a BPO want to reduce the... Most contracts are FTE based, as you know better than me. So why would you want to reduce the FTE base when the contract's tied to that? So until we get into different mechanisms in terms of the outcome-based or transaction-based contracting, I think it's not a capability question. It's more an incentive question.
But I think BPO providers are in it for the long haul. So I think when they're looking at it in that fashion, it's not a short-term thing in terms of potential cannibalization of revenue when you move from a headcount-based model to a transaction pricing model. But I have a slightly different take in terms of what the providers can bring to the table today. I think change management is an area where we end up seeing, some of the biggest issues that organizations end up facing, and I think that's certainly an area where providers have scaled up their capability to support clients in that journey itself. The ability to converge operations and technology, because often they are siloized in the client organizations and therefore break those boundaries that today exist, is an important capability that's there. And also it's potentially a trend line towards which organizations are moving towards, because once you get past the labor arbitrage, the continuous process improvement, you're looking for the next lever of value extraction, which is coming potentially through the convergence of ops and technology to drive some disproportionate value. I think the other elements of it are business drivers. I mean, today if you look at it, organizations which have aspirations of being global, but are predominantly, let's say, located either headquartered in the UK and have limited presence in markets outside of the UK. If they're looking to get into some of the emerging economies, leveraging the BPO provider as a mechanism to try and jumpstart their operations is an area where certainly I think the provider can add capabilities and allow them to actually get the benefit of time to market. If you take acquisitions, the ability to consummate an acquisition and reduce time to market out there so that the day one is achieved much quicker because you don't have to go through an intermediate step of integration is an area where I think providers can provide substantial capability to clients. A third area is emerging technologies. I mean, you take the impact of mobility, social media, and what these are doing in terms of how organizations need to look at embracing them and integrating them into their operating environments is an area where providers are investing a significant amount of capital. And last but not the least is if you need to look at the ecosystem as well. So, let's take an example. We work with a client, and the client has a large customer, and we happen to work with that customer as well. We're sitting at the center of the ecosystem, working with both the client and the customer. Our ability to look at the supply chain of the client and the demand planning environment of the customer gives us a very unique vantage point, which the client on their own right may not necessarily be able to leverage off. So the ability to get the benefit of a partner ecosystem is another benefit that the client on their own merit may not necessarily be able to offer.
Now, I'm going to ask these consulting guys who've been very, very quiet. I'm going to throw out a hypothesis. One of the challenges when you outsource is that clients very rightly want to be in control. They want to control what you do, how you do it, because quite frankly, the people in this room who are controlling contracts have a career and a organizational stake in the deal. They also are very conscious of costs. They're only paying for X. Given the fact you have limited scope, the scope is prescribed, given the fact that the client still is the adult in the equation, and given the fact that there's a cost associated, can you really get transformation and innovation and new ecosystems when, quite frankly, there's a contract in place that says you will do this, and this is how you'll do it, and this is when you'll do it, and this is what the SLA needs to look like. Peter, can you really, are providers plumbers, or are they truly leading us into the promised land?
I think there is a big risk if you're really focusing on cost reduction, and 95% of organizations who go down the outsourcing route name cost as the biggest reason, cost reduction. If you're really going for cost reduction, if you're insistent on trying to beat up your suppliers and get the best price, then you won't get innovation, you won't get transformation, you might not even get the A-team, and you might not get a very good relationship. So I think you absolutely have to balance the fact that whilst cost is there, a lot of people are outsourcing because they want access to low labor cost environments, and they don't want to build a greenfield in India or Eastern Europe. Outsourcers have the delivery network, so that's one of the primary reasons. What you've got to do is balance that with the fact that you do need to get the outsourcer to have enough flexibility to come up with some models that are going to be more transformational. And you've got to move as quickly as you can from FTE-based pricing to transaction pricing to outcome pricing. You've got to build in gain share mechanisms to allow them to actually bring innovation ideas which they're going to benefit from as well as the client. So yeah, you've got to balance the two, and it's not always the cheapest initial contract that's going to be the lowest cost in the long run.
Nick, have you seen gain share contracts that actually gain for both sides of the equation?
Well, look, I'm not going to comment on gain share contracts. So yeah, there's example where these things can work. But I'm just intrigued in terms of the language. So there's a couple of things that I think are really clear to establish. Given the link between the operations side and the technology side that you've just described, does that mean that the big transformational deals have to include both elements?
I think we're starting to see a substantial number of deals which incorporate that, but I think one of the things that at least I've ended up seeing is, from a provider perspective, the ability to view the problem more holistically, rather than saying, look, this is the prescribed scope. The scope is, let's take an accounts payable process and nothing more, versus saying, look, is there a three-way matching that's an issue? Does the ERP address that core problem statement? Is there a need for a tool or technology that sits on top of the process which helps address that problem? I think that's where the leverage is to try and bring technology and operations together to drive a different business outcome.
But if we describe the future of accounts payable, that it's all intelligent scanning and three-way matching, and that the discipline around the organization is such that that's allowed, then there's no BPO in that example.
And that might very well be the holy grail. I mean, to me, the end state in this is elimination of work.
Yeah.
It is around elimination of work. So if you can actually get to that point in time where you've done the do it cheaper, better, faster journey, and you've gone past that, can you actually get to that elimination
We're
of
all
work?
talking as if we're doing this for the first time. You talked about the adult in the relationship. There are a lot of consenting adults. There are fewer and fewer outsourcing virgins around. And there's a lot of experience in the market now which says, we're going to do this. We are going to get some value out of it. And we've forgotten one key element in all of this discussion, which is to go right back to your original question as to why we have some advantage. Because we can offer a career to people. And services are very much a people business. And the options for people, and you look at the retention figures compared to BPOs and captives, the BPOs win hands over because they can get the people on the ground, keep them and develop them. And we should never forget that.
But who are you offering careers to? Are you offering careers to people offshore? Or are you offering careers to people in this room?
Well, it depends on the model that you're operating in. So, a lot of the companies are global, and again, we're going to have a discussion about what global means, I'm sure. But most of us, and sat here, we don't just offer services from one location. We have services that are delivered right across the world, including people we've taken into our businesses, thousands of them across the operations.
But we have to be realistic about what the BPO relationship can bring for organizations. And I think, as a true consultant, I think in pyramids. And I agree with the journey statement.
Do you think in chevrons too?
No, just pyramids.
No four-box models?
No, just pyramids. Well, maybe a matrix, but a quasi-matrix.
Do you charge extra for that?
I give a discount to friends and relatives.
Okay. You've got a lot of friends and relatives. Yeah.
So going back to my original point, in terms of the pyramid, there's 4 layers. The first layer is stabilization of your processes and your operations. The second layer is process improvement. The third layer is end-to-end improvement. And then the fourth layer is this holy grail of transformation. Now, in my experiences, the BPO providers, actually, they're great at the first 2 layers. You give them the sub-functions, they'll stabilize those sub-functions. It'll be painful. It will create a lot of noise in your organizations, but it will be stabilized, and it will be stabilized relatively quickly. In terms of process improvement, again, they're relatively good at that. Give them an AP process, and they'll find an efficient way of carrying out that process. They may not remove all of the paper that's required, but they'll find a very efficient way of carrying out that process. Where I think they sometimes struggle, and this isn't necessarily the fault of the BPO provider, is the other 2 components, which is end-to-end improvement and transformation. Because for those 2 components, you really need a partnering relationship, and you really need to work together to achieve that. So whereas a BPO provider may be great at AP, there's not that many case studies of a great P2P process.
But I think we're risking becoming irrelevant. So
Who's becoming irrelevant to you?
So if you look at take finance as a whole,
Yeah.
what does finance have to do well? Finance doesn't have to manage accounts payable invoices. So if you look at the issue in most big companies, they'll say, what we don't understand is our raw material costs by category across the world. So if I'm a drinks manufacturer, I want to know how much glass I buy in every market. I want to be able to compare the contracts, and I want to be able to maximize, take advantage of my scale, and also hedge occasionally on commodities and such like. What I can't do is I can't, on a day-to-day basis, see the comparable numbers in my ledger. So I think the danger is that you talk about transformational deals around who does the transaction processing where, and you take the focus away from what's important in terms of driving value for the organization, which is actually how much do we spend on this and how do we manage that spend over time. So I think what's really important when we talk about, and this is why I keep coming back to details, it's in the detail that this is important. And if you, surprisingly for a consultant, I just don't like the word transformation. I don't like transformation or innovation, because if you ask the supplementary question when people use those terms, there's often very little behind that.
And I don't like the term value either, because actually to a lot of
So
organizations,
fundamentally, we're
value-
putting you guys out of business because you can't use
Well, value to a lot of
I think we do need
organizations
to be really
actually is
clear.
a hidden statement for I want lower costs.
Yeah, okay. So,
Oh, I don't
Well-
agree with that at all.
That's it. Well, let's
sorry,
come
I
back
don't
to
agree with that.
But I think the value is you've got to take it from the perspective of look at the client's organisation. So you look at your organisation, and what do you have to do well as a function? What do shared services or outsourcing offer you in terms of making that work? If you can't find a correlation between those two things, then it's pretty irrelevant.
Isn't transformation exactly what you just said before, because it's sort of the higher level after transition? So you said it's not about transition, so the next layer would be transformation, right? So I actually like transformation.
Well, you wrote a book on it. Is that why?
No, I'm not getting any royalties for it anymore, so I don't care
Okay.
about that. But the one that worries me is innovation. You know, when you look at the market space today, there's so many we call best practices out there. So we'll in consulting tongue now again.
So
But,
what are you going to
know,
call
there's
best
so many
practices now?
good ideas
Good
that you
ideas.
could copy.
Okay.
So you know, there's so many good ideas out there. Why don't you just copy all of them first before we sit in some blue sky room and think about innovation, but we're in third quartile in performance and haven't done all these things that are out there already? So my take is, you know, why don't we just get things done first, which are possible based on current knowledge, and you know, that sits within BPOs and advisors, and many clients are actually very intelligent in doing these things. But why don't we just get those things? We always get carried away either into the cloud or into innovation or into some other space. You know? So it is really about details, as you say, but just doing hard work just to get it done. That's what it's about.
But you know, I have again a slightly different take on this. So first, I think the challenge that's there on the table, whether you use innovation or transformation, and I won't use them interchangeably, but is, I think, an alignment question. When, as a service provider and a client, I run into several instances where the definition of what transformation means is different from different individuals. And that often is the root cause of the challenge that you start encountering later from a governance perspective. Second, I think, is the problem of comfort zone. And this is, I think service providers are guilty of it, as are clients. Everybody is happy operating on input metrics,
Right.
you know, whether it's turnaround time, accuracy, things like that, as opposed to a business outcome. And that, in some sense, stifles innovation, because everybody's got very clear boundaries of what they will operate to. And those boundary conditions, in some sense, determine the nature of the relationship. Now, I'm not saying that that's the way it works out, but it's the nature of the beast in terms of how this has evolved. And therefore, to move towards a different environment is a change issue as well, but also is a challenge from a transformation perspective. I think the third issue that's on the table is, again, a determination of what stage of the journey is a client at. Are you looking for cost-led innovation? Are you looking for process-led innovation? Are you looking for product-led innovation? And they all have different implications in terms of the maturity cycle itself. If you're playing the cost game, everybody needs to be clear that that's the game that's important for the first couple of years of the journey. You get some cost benefits, you get some process improvements, so on and so forth. If it's a different way of doing processes, maybe you start looking at adjacent processes and saying, is there an upstream, downstream play, and does that create more efficiency gains? And I think the ability to distill it in that fashion is something that, you know, requires, you know, a constant education as well as work in progress with clients to try and arrive at that outcome itself. So I think that's another area where we end up seeing a challenge, particularly from a governance perspective, to try and arrive at the end state, and which is one of the reasons why a lot of these things are broken, and people associate this with saying that they haven't derived the full value of what they're looking for from a relationship.
Well, that relationship could be also is an internal relationship. I think that rule is the same for captive as opposed. I'm going to ask Mark a question, and I want a real honest answer here. If there is this necessary evil in the outsourcing industry called an advisor, and I would like an unvarnished answer, Mark. What kind of value does an advisor play in helping a client and then also working with a provider to structure an optimal relationship?
Well, I've done a lot of work with advisors over the last 5 years, quite deliberately. And I kind of characterize them a bit like headhunters. Because if they don't know who you are, then there's no way they're going to be able to advise their clients accordingly. So we've seen quite a lot back, but it's changed. And I think what's changed is organizations have become much more savvy at handling their own outsourcing activity. It's become tougher for advisors. And you can see that because suddenly there are a whole host of offerings coming out to the advisory community to help me rather than help customers. And there's
Do you need help?
Always need help. And I have benefited from advisors, that's the honest answer. We put a lot into it. It doesn't always work out, but where it is important, and I've said this to a number of customers, is if you're going to have somebody advise you in the transaction, don't let them go the day you've signed the contract. Make them stick around for the tough bit, which is transition, and help you through that. Because it's very difficult once you've gone through that process then to lose all that learning immediately. And I think there's a real responsibility for the advisory community to stick around in that part of the deal.
Nick, you're bobbing your head vigorously.
No, I think there's a great philosophy generally around projects, transformational or otherwise, is that people tend to roll off, the advisors disappear, or the steering committee is demobilised at the end of the project, not when the actual benefits are realised. So I just think philosophically people should stick around and live with whatever they've created and implemented until the benefits are
So you'll go at risk on your fees?
Yeah.
You heard
And
it
actually,
here?
I mean, I think the advisors can be beneficial to the suppliers. If we're involved, typically the customer isn't time wasting. The clock's ticking. They're not going to pay us a load of money if they actually don't take it anywhere. And we can quite quickly get down to a short list and just deal with maybe 2 or 3, rather than the client has a tendency to deal with too many too long and end up wasting a lot of time.
Provided you do that quickly
Yeah.
and efficiently.
Yeah.
Because the old way of doing it, we were all dragging along and incurring huge costs forever.
Yeah.
And I think there's also a maturity on both our sides for us to be able to say, thank you very much for offering us the next date. We've decided not to proceed, and that to be accepted and acceptable to people.
I do think the advisory market has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. Whereas maybe 10 years ago, you'd get a team of 10 advisors supporting a big outsourcing decision project. I think in today's age, because BPO is more mature, it's really around what capability does that organization need to support that transaction. So it's more specific, it's more specialized, and I'd agree with Mark's point earlier around it should be focused not only at that initial negotiation and contractual stage, but after that, where the pain is in the transition, and even after that in terms of stabilization as well, and making sure that governance is embedded, and making sure that everything is working smoothly before rolling off.
The advisor's output should be business as usual services, not just the contract.
Can I
Please.
slightly different views that when we have this discussion about kind of the advisory market, the BPO market, shared services or outsourcing, do we mislead people, and people being this audience, in terms of what's possible in our role, and understate what's important about the behavioural change that's required in an organisation to make shared services or outsourcing work? Because take P2P, because we always use that as an example. If nobody raises purchase orders and there's no discipline around goods receipting, it's very difficult to manage a 3-way match in a shared services, whether it's owned, whether it's captive or outsourced.
I think
So
there was.
Understand the...
I think we, in the early years, 10, 15 years ago, we focused on the shared service centre, let's say, and we built really good shared service centres and didn't realise that the retained organisation had become bloated. There was no purchase order policy. There was no compliance to any policies that were in place. Stakeholders hadn't been brought along, and there was massive resistance, and the thing sort of collapsed. So I think we've realized that you've got to take a holistic approach, and you've got to get the senior management commitment. You've got to make sure you understand the stakeholders. You've got to reorganize, re-engineer the retained organization. If you're doing outsourcing, you must look at vendor management. That's absolutely vital. So I think we have realized that. I think sometimes clients take a lot of convincing that they need to invest in all of that stuff. So it's,
But if you can do that, hallelujah, because it's going to make our life easier.
Yeah.
Well, that's my point, is that we kind of have this slightly insular debate about the shared services or the outsource piece without making really clear that there's an enormous amount and possibly sometimes the majority of the value locked up in the client's behaviour.
This has been my frustration for the last 3 or 4 years. A number of companies like yours I've spoken to have said, please, put something together for that phase for the client. And I'm really surprised there isn't more of it. Because it's vital to the success of what we do.
Yeah,
and there's
I
a
think
big
we
gap
should
missed.
probably not spend too much time on discussing why we and them are so great. But what I do agree with, and I'm not sure, is it allowed to say something positive on BPOs?
Yeah, you might.
They do have some trouble, as was pointed out, with the scopes that are given to them sometimes by clients. You know, I sit with clients often and I say, well, why don't we give them, you know, this process, but only in that region, and that piece of that process, but only for that business unit, and then let's see how good of job they do. And then if they do a really good job on that, then we can enlarge that. But if you get that piecemeal, it's really hard to do that good job on it. Never mind all the technology discussion we just had, because how are you going to put any technology on those small pieces? So, you know, your example of PTP, of course, is perfect, because that's a prime example where if you don't do the optimization at the front end, you're not going to get anything done at the back end either. Right?
Multi-country HR is a favourite. Let's do all the little
But
countries
haven't we
first.
done a disservice to shared services and outsourcing to a great extent, because we've really, in some respects, and maybe it's the advisory community who are responsible for this, boiled it down to a sourcing exercise, and we forget that the sourcing is the act of procurement. It's not when you change the business model, it is a fact. We've been focusing on the act. How do you all make that change? Because what I see is time after time is everyone's focusing on the act, the deal, whether it's shared services or outsourcing, and no one is really spending time underneath that waterline. How do you get the industry to change that?
I think organizations are changing. I think the advisors are changing. I think you've got 4 of us sitting here. When we advise customers, we do talk about change management and project management, because those type of skills are actually critical in any sourcing arrangement. And if you listen to lessons learned after transitions when organizations go through BPOs, the 2 biggest concerns are always around change management and project management. We weren't ready for our internal change. We thought that the BPO provider would manage that. And you know, going back to some earlier comments made, it is completely underestimated the level of change that occurs within these transactions. And no matter how much you do advise your customers, you know, change is one of those woolly terms that a lot of people don't believe in.
Going back
you
to
really
your,
have to bring it down to specifics and details.
go back
of what
to your
it means for a
question,
business.
Deborah. Yes, the actual deal is the sourcing bit, but organizations, when they get to that stage, they should have had several months at looking at, I won't go back and talk about the 8 levers again, but looking at the opportunities to automate and standardize and eliminate and so forth. And it's that piece of work that is done beforehand that's absolutely vital. You know, you don't want to outsource 500 people when you can get them down to 120 within 9 months through some clever use of self-service and web tools and so forth. So you absolutely need to look at the big picture. And before you start saying, well, yes, and this is the portion that needs to be outsourced, you need to look, what is the target operating model? What is the interface with ERP? What are the automation plays? What is the order? What's the migration strategy going to be? Yes, then we know this bit needs to be sourced externally. This bit needs to be a captive center of excellence. This is the change program. This is the technology. This is the elimination and simplification. It needs to be one holistic project. You can't just look at that sourcing bit.
And who are the people you want to live with for the next 5 to 10 years as well?
But you know, I'd argue otherwise. I don't think it's that straightforward in terms of saying, you know, there's a sequential ordering of the steps itself. The choice between whether one goes down a lift and shift path versus a fix and shift path.
I agree.
Depends on a bunch of different variables.
Yeah, there's
as
some
well.
things that you say, well, actually, let's get that labor arbitrage, because if we wait for ERP, I mean, I'm working with a couple of organizations now, and if they wait for ERP, it's going to take 8 years before they get a significant labor arbitrage in all the countries. So some of it needs to go your mess for less, sorted out there.
Yeah,
What you don't want to do is create too much of a mess.
that's right.
You know, you need to have that balance.
But doesn't it really come down to just defining actually what do you want from that relationship? What are you trying to achieve, whether it's shared services, outsourcing, whether it's finance transformation, getting down to the details and defining what you want. If you want innovation, you can get innovation. If you want transformation, you can get transformation. All you have to do is then define it, then ask for it, and actually be willing to pay for that.
I don't want to be characterised as anti-BPA, so I'm neutral on BPA. So I think whether it's captive or it's outsourcing is purely a nature of the criteria in place and the circumstance. One of the things I'm interested to hear about in terms of the innovation piece is what you guys are doing around analytics, because when we talk about the value of the function and the value to the organisation, there is an opportunity there to bring both the operational side of it, the IT, and perhaps some data tools that you have and you have access to people that normal clients don't have. So I think there's something here that helps people in the audience understand it's not about doing an AP invoice efficiently. This is about what other value can you create through this relationship.
No, and I think that's a fair point. I think if you look at where the industry is moving, and a lot of the mature clients are starting to get the advantage of, it's beyond the labor arbitrage, it's beyond the process improvement, but it's around the actionable insights that they're getting on the data that service providers are processing on a regular basis, whether it's transactional information or judgmental information, and the ability to leverage that to come back and say, you know, in the context of a source-to-pay process, the ability for the CPO to get a dashboard which says this is the kind of spend visibility, these are the spend analytics, these are the suppliers that you can optimize, and things like that makes a whole lot more sense than just someone saying, look, I've reduced your transaction cost or the cost per invoice from X to Y. And I think that's the kind of benefit that organizations are seeing. Or if you take a process like trade promotions, you know, you work with a consumer packaged goods company, and if there is an opportunity to reduce or improve the effectiveness of the field force, and you're starting to provide some actionable insights on that, that's the kind of information that I think clients are starting to enjoy and get the benefit of, as opposed to just saying, look, I was at a $100 cost earlier, now I'm at $70 and that's it.
Trade promotion savings will dwarf anything that can be achieved in terms of operational costs.
We see a lot in utilities. Smart metering is going to be delivering millions and millions of readings daily. We're going to do all that information. So it's no longer a question of just delivering a service and a few spreadsheets off it. It's about customer lifetime value. And the challenge for us then is to try and help our customers understand that into a business case. Because that's not something which you can go, oh yes, and this is where I firmly disagree with your value statement. It's not a question of I can do this for 2/3 or a third of the price. It's what can you create from that information, and analytics is key to that. And we've all invested in that pretty heavily.
Well, let's turn it now over to the audience. You've heard Tom talk about good ideas. You've heard Ritesh talk about actionable insights and every shade in between. Audience, since we've got such an illustrious panel up here of experts, can I invite you please to ask whatever question you'd like? Questions? Any questions on how to get those good ideas? Yes, sir. Ma'am.
We want the questions from opposite sides of the room each time, don't we?
And also maybe from the opposition. I'm from BDO, so the accountancy company. My interest is what the trends you're seeing are in insourcing, so people coming out of the outsourced contracts and bringing them back in, or even bringing things back on country.
Well, I don't know if there's a provider up here who will ever admit that he's been insourced, but maybe these two are different. But gentlemen?
I think the remarkable thing is how many F&A, let's say F&A BPO contracts have there been? Something like 800. Very few have actually been terminated and brought back in. I think there have been cases where people have, you know, maybe tried to do collections and pull collections back, or billings and pull billings back, but very few have been actually terminated. I think it's more common perhaps on the call center side, where there's voice stuff going to India and it hasn't worked in a segment, you know, so business segment, Dell, you know, brought back their business outsourcing call center activities from India. I've heard of one or two organizations who tried to move up the value chain and put some of the business partnering stuff to India, and the attrition rates were too high for that particular type of finance activity, and they pulled it back. Interestingly, they didn't put it back to the UK, they pulled it to a captive in India because they felt they could manage attrition more. So I think the news is that there's been remarkably little activity brought back in. There have been a few examples, but very few complete contracts terminated.
I'm going to make it a mission, but it's a slightly different admission. Before I joined, we had a deal, and we put so much automation into it. We said to the customer there was no point in you outsourcing this anymore, and that went back. But that's slightly different, but that can happen.
Maybe just
There
to
was
add
no longer
something
value
to
in
that.
that particular relationship.
I'm not disagreeing the ratio is great. You know, most of them are successful. But we have to remember when we look at these numbers, right, that when you have engaged into this kind of relationship, it's like the marriage picture we had up there yesterday, right? Not going to break it up for some minor reasons.
Yeah.
So when you're locked into this contract, basically it's going to cost the CFO's head, right, when this thing breaks up. So they're going to do everything possible on both sides to make it work out. So therefore, there's not going to be too many cases where it's taken back. And even if there were, we're going to do everything possible not to make it transparent, right? Because I mean, it's just
So it's
not-
staying together for the sake of the children, yes?
Actually, can I just add one thing to what I said? I think there have been remarkably few contracts that have been brought back, but there's still a lot of adverse noise about organizations not happy with their outsourced contracts. And I think there's a lot of subjectivity out there. There's a lot of emotion out there. What organizations need to do is really understand, if they think the contract isn't working well, really understand why that's the case. Because often they just say, well, it's been a disaster. And if you actually talk to people who set it up, who are getting the cost benefit, it's been incredibly good on cost benefit. But you know, big shared services programs, whether they're outsourced or captive, are difficult. Stabilization periods can be 3, 6, 9, 12 months. It's quite traumatic. A lot of people are fired. They are very, very traumatic things to do. So I think a lot of the bad will, if there is still bad will, is around things that are always going to have that type of emotion attached to them. And what organizations need to do is really understand objectively, has it been successful or not, on a number of sort of balanced scorecard metrics.
And it's around the expectation as well. You know, I've been involved in advising on 3 in-source deals. So it does happen, and it probably happens a little bit more than is announced to the media.
Well, it's never announced to the media, actually.
But you know, generally it happens, I think, because of a mismanagement of expectations. You know, the client may be expecting less noise and less pain than they go through.
Should we
but
blame
also
the
the
advisors
BPO
then?
provider also sometimes expects it to be more profitable than it ends up being. And the instances I've worked on, it's actually been a mutual decision by both parties stating that this isn't working and let's get a divorce, but let's do it quickly. And it's normally, in my experience, is done in years 1 to 3.
I've actually seen a couple of trivial reasons for which contracts could potentially go down the in-source path. So in addition to what everybody else has said, I think if the client has a hybrid operating model, they have a captive that's already existent along with a third-party outsourcing arrangement. And let's say you end up having a situation where your captive is not really picked up from a scale standpoint. And the distribution of work between the captive and the third-party outsourcing model could be where the core processes, and I know the definition of core and non-core keeps shifting, but let's for a moment assume that the core processes sit in the captive and the non-core transactional stuff sits in the third-party outsourcing model. Because you've already made, the client has made a significant capital investment in a facility and people and stuff like that, there probably may be a propensity at times to say, let's move everything away from the third-party outsource model to a captive environment itself. And I think that's been a situation where something might end up going in-source because it ends up being, their organization in a different location, as opposed to, going down the third-party path.
Other questions?
We have one back here.
Please.
Hi, Siobhan Brown, B-Sky B. You spoke about client behaviours being critical. What are the top 3 behaviours from a client that are going to help make this a little less painful?
I'd say this. Once you've made a decision to go with somebody, it's not a competition anymore. It's a joint effort. So you have to make that mindset. It becomes a team. Knowledge transfer is vital. Please share. And do not underestimate how much work you're going to have to do in transition. It is not a lightweight task. And I've seen it done very well, and I was pleased to sit here and discuss that with somebody yesterday. I've seen it done in small organizations who can't afford the resourcing and it's tough. And I had one major utility who said, we'd like to give you our HR function. You have 4 weeks, we've fired all the staff. I wouldn't recommend that as a solution.
Other tips and techniques?
I think that's in terms of setup. I think then in terms of day-to-day operations, there's a compliance to the new process and a discipline and penalty for non-compliance that's important. So there's no point investing all this time and effort in setting up either an outsourced or a captive shared services if you're not actually going to try and run your process better. So there's a recognition that that is down at the transactional level, whether it's raising purchase orders and having them approved and goods receipting, or whether it's in the order to cash process and there's greater discipline on the sales force. It's just important to understand the implications for behaviour and what discipline actually means in that context.
And at the strategic layer as well, I think having the right governance structures is very important as well. What tends to happen, and Ritesh and Mark will complain about this, what tends to happen in a lot of outsourcing transactions is that you get the senior stakeholders involved at the start, and there's a lot of focus when you're negotiating and when you sign off the contract. And then from an organization's point of view, they disappear. We find actually if you want to change behaviors in an organization, have that joint governance throughout the life of the contract and discuss those things that are working well and not working well. Because some of the things will be the fault of the provider, and some of the things will be the fault of the behavior of the organization. Actually, if you can fix those behavioral problems, then sometimes you can make much more savings than saving another 10% of 10 FTE in AP.
I'd like to suggest that one of the things I've seen is that to make real change, whether it's shared services or outsourcing, I think those of you in the room who are responsible have to not be concerned about losing your jobs. Because being daring and bold enough to do the right thing for your organization is not necessarily a career maximizing move. I don't know what you all see, but sometimes doing the right thing for the organization does not help you all personally. You see that, Tom?
I agree. I think it depends, though, a lot on the company's culture. And I think those people who are in the process know exactly what the culture is and how that will play out. So that's why in some cases that works the way you said it. In some cases it doesn't, simply because they, intellectually they know that, but it just doesn't work in the culture. But I think Mark's first point was the one that I'd like to underline. Once you've entered this relationship, it's not a competition, and even more so, I think it's not a customer-vendor relationship. It's more something like business partnering. Let's throw out the blah blah, but it's an elevated relationship where you're trying to achieve a common goal. That said, I still think that a good customer also is somebody who drives the BPO crazy. And what I mean by that is, you need to be pushing for those improvements. I mean, you cannot throw everything over the fence and say, okay, please take care of it and come back in a year and then you've cleaned it all up. I mean, it is a process where you have to participate in it. And some of the great ideas, at least initially in the process, have to be coming from the client side. I mean, the BPO will require some time to get into the processes. After a few years, they know them better than the client does. But initially, the client needs to help in that improvement process.
Other questions? Emma, time for one more? Are we pretty much? One more. Thank you.
Hello, David Uni from Tenneco Automotive. Tom said right at the start that he saw the companies that went for outsourcing tend to be those with excellent processes or those that have dire processes. That leaves a lot of companies in the middle. Are they broadly making the right choice by keeping it internally?
What I mean by saying that is that if you look at the distribution, then there's an awfully lot of companies who are very good and very bad who do that. Doesn't mean that all the people in between don't do it, right? But it is quite logical that these groups go for it more than others, because there is not one type of company in one type of situation that outsources. Otherwise it would be easy for those guys, but that's exactly the dilemma we're all in, that out of a big list of criteria, you can generate all kinds of combinations where it makes sense, and different types of outsourcing relationships that would then make sense because of the different situation you're in. So, as all of my colleagues here stated, I think it's not only about the sourcing decision. You know, this is a journey which is about improvement, and if the sourcing decision to utilize some outsourcing and some captive makes sense, then whatever combination works is the best solution for that company.
I think
what we see also is that in that medium bracket, it's increasing. So we didn't go into that, but you know, the hybrid solutions are huge trend currently. Everybody's going for some sort of hybrid solution. And there's a lot of outsourcing. If you look at companies, for example, in the mid-market, so mid-sized companies are outsourcing significantly more than some other groups. So there is growth in exactly those areas. So it could also be just a photo at a point in time, you know, that we do. And then the other ones who were lagging before are now going to catch up. So I think in sum, I'm not saying that it only makes sense to these two groups. It was just a picture of what it used to be so far.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting observation, and certainly when organizations feel that they've got the single standard instance and automated, so they may say, well, let's just see if an outsourcer can give us a little bit more or get a bit more arbitrage, so that makes sense. If organizations have completely screwed up processes and technologies, they may, especially at some time in the future, say, let's not even bother trying to fix this. Let's get an outsourcer who's got a platform-based solution. Let's actually jump straight onto theirs, you know, and down the years, cloud will come in at some stage. You know, Salesforce.com doesn't really exist for the finance function for major organizations, but at some stage, that kind of capability will improve and improve, and organizations will start saying, should we even bother building our legacy ERP? Can we not get an outsource provider potentially with a cloud provider to give us the technology and process solutions? So I think what you said is interesting, especially for the smaller organizations. Startups, I think increasingly will say, let's not bother building all of this infrastructure internally, the technology infrastructure, and we'll just go for a solution.
And I said yesterday, you know, all customers are not created equal in terms of where they are on this journey, and I believe that. And I think we've learned collectively how to deal with that. I think it's very easy to be scared of this is a complete mess, or how on earth am I going to add value to somebody who's already been in an outsourcing relationship for 6 years? But I think the industry's moved on to that.
Well, with that, the industry's moved on. Thank you, Mark. That was a great closing statement. I'd like to ask you to join me to give a hand for this year's G6. Thank you very much, gentlemen.